So good evening, welcome. My name is Peter Henry. I'm Dean of the NYU Stern School of Business, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you, our guests, alumni, and friends, to the launch of our new Center for the Globalization of Education and Management, led by Global Professor of Management and Strategy, Pankaj Ghemawat, who joined NYU Stern's faculty this fall. Many of you know Pankaj, but for those of you who don't, I think it's probably unlikely in this room. He's a global business strategist, preeminent scholar, and prolific author. And just this morning, he unveiled the 2014 Global Connectedness Index, which he co-authored with Stephen Altman. And we did that at a ceremony uptown with DHL. And tonight, he's going to share some of his findings with you. And there are a lot of findings. This is a very important. And when I say dense, I don't mean that in any pejorative way. It is chock full of insights, so you're really in for a treat. We're also honored to have with us tonight Arun Kumar, Director General, U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, and Assistant Secretary for Global Markets and International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce, joining us from Washington, D.C. And I want to just add on a personal note, Arun was my very first neighbor when I moved to Palo Alto, California many years ago. So Arun and I know each other very well. He knows my children as well. So it's a pleasure to talk about global connectedness, to welcome you here to Stern this evening, Arun. And just as a side note, Arun himself is a published author, although it's published a book of poetry called Plain Truths. So I imagine that he may be speaking some plain truths here tonight as well. We look forward to that, Secretary Kumar. And finally, last but not least, we are pleased to have Christopher Kane, President of the Center for Global Enterprise with us. As Vice President of Global Programs for IBM, Chris was responsible for the global public policy issues that impacted IBM, and now heads this new private research institution for globalization, whose work dovetails very nicely with that of our center, and we look forward to the work we might do together. So just briefly, let me say it would be very hard to overstate the importance of globalization to the world. And here at NYU, as part of the world's first global network university, we take these truths to be self-evident. But there's some things we don't take to be self-evident, and we like to have facts. In particular, as an empirical economist, I like to see facts. And Pankaj's work in measuring the global flows of trade, capital, people, and information as a critical component to our understanding of globalization by bringing facts to bear on theory, and in many cases, sometimes it's just opinion. And Pankaj has no qualms about punching holes in unvalidated opinions. He has added precision and insight to our discussions of global economic trends, and his work allows us to look deeply into globalization at the regional and country level and to inform policy decision-making as well as decisions about corporate strategy. We're excited, to say the least, to inaugurate the NYU Stern Center for Globalization of Education Management this evening. The center is dedicated to the study of globalization, broadly speaking, and to the more specific areas of globalization in education and management. With Pankaj at the helm of the new center, we feel as though we're in a position to lead important areas of inquiry on the most pressing issues facing firms, organizations, and countries seeking to thrive in our interconnected global economy. So let me end there and just say, please hold your questions for the Q&A session at the very end. And with that, I turn the microphone over to Pankaj Ghemawat.
So good evening, and thanks very much to all of you for coming to this event. I'm deeply moved, and as my daughter can probably tell you, I sometimes have a tendency to choke up when I get deeply moved, but there's so many people to thank here in terms of having made this possible. While I could take up all the time that we have just going through the list, I did particularly want to note the role that Peter has played in making something that we've talked about for some time now a reality. So I'm enormously grateful to Peter. I'm enormously grateful to Stern for offering me this opportunity. And before I sort of totally lose the thread, being a content guy, I thought I would just sort of switch to talking a little bit about what the center is going to do as a slightly easier way of giving you a little bit of a sense of what this initiative is about and what we hope it will become in the years to come. So I think there is a website, and the website is now operational. So if you want more details, then it's actually polite to offer at an evening gathering. I would suggest maybe going to the website and taking a look. You'll notice that the website is actually structured in terms of, apart from center, the three substantives that compose the name of the center. So there's a section on globalization, there's a section on management, and there's a section on education. And that's because these words were chosen very deliberately to reflect a particular set of choices about what the center would and would not focus on. So what I thought I would do, and again, the idea is not to prolong the discussions this evening, but what I thought I would do is just talk to you a little bit, not about all the things that are underway under each of these rubrics, but give you a little bit of a taste of what the center is doing or what the center will be doing on each of these fronts. What we'll spend the most time on, just because this is what I was busy preparing over the weekend for this morning's release of the Global Connectedness Index, is talking a little bit about some of the general work on globalization. And for those of you who can't really wait to go look at the link on the DHL website, it's not vaporware. There actually is a report that you can peruse at your leisure. And so what we'll spend the bulk of our time on is just talking a little bit about some of where this work on globalization has been. But then I did want to, and I'll start off by talking about that, and then Arun Kumar, whom I've known for a number of years, will talk a little bit about the public policy perspective, particularly from the standpoint of the U.S. Commerce Department in terms of what some of these kinds of analyses imply for U.S. policy going forward. Then more briefly, because those are more nascent projects, we'll talk a little bit about some of the management research agenda that the center is about. And this is where Chris Kane will step up and talk a little bit about joint venture between the new Center for the Globalization of Education and Management. And Peter was asking me this morning, the prepositions get a little bit complicated, so probably simplest to refer to it as CGEM, which was one of the thoughts behind stringing these words together in this particular order. Chris will talk about the joint venture between CGEM and the Center for Global Enterprise that he runs, because we're embarked on and in the early stages of what I think will be a very exciting research project that should come to fruition by the end of this coming year. And then finally, last but not least, also nascent, I do want to wrap up by talking just a little bit about the educational mission of the center, because there is something very interesting going on, not just at Stern, but more broadly at NYU as the world's first global network university, that made this the place that I really wanted to come back to when I decided to try and reestablish a bit of a presence in the United States. So that very roughly is a little bit of the plan for this evening, and we are conscious of when this event is supposed to end. So I'll keep my watch. I'll actually take my watch off and keep my eyes fixed on the time as we go through. Because the Globalization Index, having lived and breathed this for the last few months, along with my longtime collaborator on this project, Stephen Altman, who's going to be the executive director of the new center. And Steve, if you can just raise your hand. So that's Steve. And Steve's probably spent more nights in the last couple of months dreaming about the data, and these are not pleasant dreams necessarily, than I have. But the index did have a way of taking over our lives. And so as I was trying to decide what to talk about this evening, occurred to me more than 1 million data points. This works out to 1,000 data points a second. And so I figured I would take the high road rather than subject you to all the wonderful charts that we prepared for this particular effort. But the basic question is, why so much measurement around globalization? And I think part of the answer is that this is an area in which a lot of intuitions are still very, very extreme. On the one hand, you have people who do believe that the world is perfectly connected. And I was on talk radio about 3 hours ago, and the interlocutor was asking me, so what's new about this index? And for him, it was a big aha that the index says the world is not perfectly connected, or not flat, as he put it. At the other extreme, you have a debate that actually has gained a certain amount of support for this particular viewpoint, that globalization is somehow over. And in between these two extremes is where I think some of the data that I will present, some of the few data points that I will touch on this evening, tend to suggest we are, with some very definite implications for policymakers, both in the public sector and the private sector. So what is this global connectedness construct that we're trying to measure? Basically, this is an index that we've been putting together with DHL since 2011. And the idea, very simply, is to broaden beyond the usual focus on just merchandise trade, or merchandise trade and foreign direct investment, to look somewhat more multidimensionally at what's actually happening in terms of globalization. And this followed naturally from a book that I published in 2011, which made the point that the world wasn't perfectly integrated and was less integrated than many people thought. When DHL approached me, it did seem like the constructive next step to go beyond debunking the extremes to actually doing some measurement oneself. And that's why I got involved in this project, although historically this is not the kind of project that I'd actually worked on. So what's distinctive about this particular index, because if you're a connoisseur, you'll realize that there are actually multiple globalization indices floating around, is something that we like to call the 3D approach to thinking about globalization. So looking at depth, at distribution, and at directionality. And in general, what tends to happen when people do bother to measure globalization, they literally focus on just the first of these particular dimensions. That's important, but we try and go beyond that to provide a little bit of a more complete picture of what's going on. Having said that, let me start by explaining these quantities before I start showing you a few of the results from the report. Depth is basically this idea of how much stuff crosses the borders. And so two cartograms on the right that show the countries / territories that were top ranking and bottom ranking on this particular year's index in regard to depth. So if you look at the map of Hong Kong on the top right-hand side, that's a map in which the world is drawn in proportion to Hong Kong's merchandise exports, with Hong Kong occupying a little bit of territory that roughly indicates its relative scale. Hong Kong, given the amount of transshipment that it does, would be negatively sized if we actually drew this exactly to scale. So in Hong Kong, you have an example of territory whose depth in terms of merchandise trade is actually greater than 100%, in the sense that when you look at the total trade that Hong Kong engages in, that's greater than Hong Kong's GDP. The same for Singapore. In contrast, Iran, on the bottom right-hand side, is drawn to scale. The rest of the world is drawn in proportion to how much Iran exports to the rest of the world in terms of merchandise, and Iran in proportion to its GDP minus those exports. And you kind of sort of see that not only is the world not completely globalized, but there are huge variations in the globalization levels of countries / territories, to the point where you can find 100-fold variations in the depth of globalization. which is one of the reasons why it seemed interesting to do a little bit of measurement after having established that the extreme endpoints really aren't a very good characterization of where the world is at. The second thing, and this is unique, all globalization indices try and measure depth, but none of the other indices that I'm aware of, and we're now into double digits, actually try and measure distribution, or a particular measure of distribution that we focus on, breadth, which is most indices start with how much stuff crosses the border, but don't look at where it goes. And yet there's clearly a difference between, say, the Bahamas, which has a very high intensity of tourism, but does derive 80% of its tourists from the United States, and a situation in which those inflows or outflows might be much more globally distributed. So on this year's index, and here we're no longer drawing countries to scale at all, because otherwise, because of the depth factor, they would crowd out the whole map and obscure all variation. Top on breadth this year was the UK, and you get a sense that the UK actually has a very broad set of destinations for its merchandise exports. In contrast, Botswana ranked at the bottom, and that's because Botswana's exports are mostly raw, unpolished diamonds, most of which get sent to the Central Selling Organization in London before being distributed to various diamond cutting centers around the world. So again, you get a little bit of a sense of how much variation there is in this particular regard in terms of different countries. And this is the kind of thing that allows us to actually look not just at how integrated different countries are with the world in terms of depth, but where does their output go? Is regionalization increasing or decreasing? How well are advanced economies dealing with the shift in the world center of economic gravity towards emerging markets, unless you have a sense not just of how much stuff crosses the border, but also where it goes? It's hard to answer, it's impossible to answer those kinds of questions. And then the final D is directionality, and here I have a map of the Netherlands illustrating how much directionality can differ. So the Netherlands, where I've been doing some work recently, basically has Rotterdam, which sucks in a lot of imports from the rest of the world and then serves as a transshipment point to Germany and other parts more in the interior of Europe. And so when you look at the Dutch merchandise import and export maps, they're actually quite different, quite unbalanced. And having some foreknowledge of what Arun is going to talk about later on this evening, directionality is of huge concern to policymakers. When we think of, for instance, the US trade deficit, clearly people in the Commerce Department don't look at exports and imports symmetrically in terms of priorities for the Commerce Department going forward. We'll hear a little bit more just a little bit later on what the Commerce Department is actually doing in this respect. But the point that I want to make is if merchandise flows are imbalanced, which they are, most non-trade flows are 2 to 5 times as unbalanced as merchandise flows are. So not paying attention to directionality really misses out on some fundamental asymmetries. And to turn to make this a little bit vivid, and this year we had some help from some hardcore visualization experts, also sitting in the room, Rahul Basole and Hyunwoo Park, if you can raise your hands, at generating some of the pretty pictures. You haven't seen anything yet. This is like the simplest visualization they prepared. But the typical index, when it sort of tries to measure depth, this is the kind of information that would be built into it, where the sizes of the different circles represent the sizes of different countries' merchandise exports. And basically, the kind of information that we needed to do what we did was obviously a bit more involved. You need a couple of 100 times more information if you're actually going to pay attention to distribution and to directionality. And so that's one of the reasons why we had these months of, dealing with and occasionally dreaming about the data. There really were a lot of data points once you start trying to track the other 2 dimensions of the 3D framework. So that's all by way of, I suppose, throat clearing or explaining a little bit what goes into this index, just to share with you very briefly some of the findings from actually going to all this trouble. The big question right now seems to be, is globalization up or down? And this is something that wasn't much of a concern before the financial crisis, but about which there actually is considerable debate at this point. So the bottom line conclusion that we came to after processing all these data in a way described in exhaustive, excruciating detail in the report that we put together is that basically the world has gotten up to the level of globalization that it had immediately prior to the financial crisis. So we haven't really broken new ground, but we have gotten through, or we seem to have gotten past some of the very significant dislocations on the trade and capital front in particular that were observed in the immediate wake of the financial crisis. And one other, and here I should put in a self-promotion alert, but one other point I'd make is that actually, if you look at the other globalization indices out there, they kind of sailed through the financial crisis without showing any kind of downturn at all. So it does seem to me that using a globalization index that misses out on what many people regard as the single biggest drop-off of globalization in the last few decades might be something that one might want to question, but enough said along those lines. To decompose this aggregate measure into the depth and breadth components that make it up, the red line is the depth of globalization aggregated across trade, capital, information, and people flows. And so that's somewhat reassuring in the sense that after the stagnation between 2011 and 2012, that stirred a lot of these debates about whether globalization was over, we do seem to start to see some increases again. So that's on balance positive rather than negative news, given that there still seem to be huge untapped opportunities to increase global welfare through additional depth of globalization. The green line goes in the opposite direction. That's the breadth calculation that we did. And the basic idea here is that as the world's economic output, as the world's center of economic gravity shifts towards emerging economies, advanced economies in particular haven't really quite kept up with that shift. And so when we weight across advanced and emerging economies, what we actually see are declining breadth numbers. Advanced economies have reacted. They're exporting, for instance, more outside their own regions. They're shipping farther distances, but the magnitude of those reactions or adjustments hasn't quite kept up with, to mangle an image, the extent to which the world is being pulled farther apart by this big shift. Because if we think back to say the 1980s, back when China and India's share of world GDP was under 10%, the world economy was essentially, with the exception of Japan, centered on the North Atlantic. Things are much farther flung now, and one of the things that we note, since we're looking at distribution or breadth as well as depth, is that many countries haven't quite kept up with this particular shift. So those are sort of some of the basic conclusions from this year's index. Second question that always comes up is, who ranked first? And this is the sort of thing that journalists in particular tend to be particularly fascinated by. So without pretending that, the same level of interest attaches to these rankings as did to the recent ranking of the world's top 200 universities, and I'm still trying to process why rankings of the world's top 200 universities attract so much more media attention than rankings of the world's countries in terms of globalization levels. We had, once again, as in years past, the Netherlands ranking at the top of the heap, and not because it came out first either in terms of depth or breadth, but really because of a combination of strengths along those two separate dimensions. So this is a chart that pulls apart the depth and breadth components. We see that depth tends to be dominated by wealthy but really small economies. Think of Singapore or Luxembourg. Wealthy economies also tend to do well in terms of breadth, but you see larger economies typically having broader patterns of engagement. And the Netherlands, while not huge, I mean, I was born in India, so that obviously conditions one's perspective on what's large versus what's small, is certainly a little bit larger than Luxembourg, a little bit larger than Singapore in terms of population. And so that's the reason why the Netherlands really ends up on the top of these particular rankings. Since this is an academic institution, also point out that we actually engage in some regression analyses, since it's well known that large countries tend to trade less intensively than small countries. The question of interest is, well, when you look at a particular country, is it more or less involved with the world economy than you would expect based on its structural characteristics such as size, level of per capita income, et cetera? And what we see on this particular chart is that Southeast Asian economies in particular are the overperformers. They're the ones above this 45-degree line. And there's a more miscellaneous cast of characters who are the red dots below the line that are kind of underperforming. And another frequent issue is who increased or decreased the most their ranks, who improved or suffered the biggest fall in the rankings. And this is increases since 2005. These are decreases since 2005. And one could comment on lots of these things, but I'm going to move on beyond noting that actually sanctions do seem to have an effect. If you look at the red bars and which countries really have suffered the biggest drop-offs. In fact, Syria suffered the biggest single drop-off on both depth and breadth between 2011 and 2013 of any country in the particular sample. So if all this leaves you wanting more, rather than less, it's possible to go to 140 country profiles that we have at the end of the index that provide key scores and trends, talk a little bit, show a map of what merchandise exports look like, provide ranks at the levels of individual components, talk about overall directionality, and supply some summary measures of structural characteristics and policy choices that, in case you wanted to run your own regressions, might be handy ingredients to have around. So I think that's all that I'm going to say at the level of individual countries. I also had some slides on how different regions have fared, but intuition told me as I was doing my final run through that maybe that might be just a little bit too much good stuff to put into the presentation at this juncture. So let me just sort of put up 2 or 3 more slides on slightly different themes. One of the striking things from our breadth calculations is that we now sort of see emerging economies being involved at one or both ends of the majority of international interactions. So this is the big shift that I was talking about. The blue at the very bottom is advanced to advanced country interactions. The purple at the very top is emerging to emerging or south-south interactions. The ones in between are ones that have emerging economies involved at one or the other end of those interactions. And what you basically note when you look at trade and many other things is that pretty much all the growth in absolute terms in world merchandise trade, for instance, since the financial crisis has been in categories other than that blue bar, that blue area swept out at the bottom of this chart. So that's another manifestation of this big shift that I was talking about earlier. And while we resolutely stay away from offering forecasts in this particular report, it is interesting to observe that while emerging economies have come to be much more important in volume terms, especially in terms of capital flows, information flows, and people flows, they're much less intensely globalized still than advanced economies. And so if globalization is going to grow in the future, just arithmetically, it seems plausible that a large chunk of that growth is going to involve emerging economies. Some other, just thrown in for fun, the Globalization Index turns out to be correlated, we've discovered, with all kinds of other interesting things which we're starting to research. So last year I did a little analysis of who runs the Fortune Global 500, where the top management teams from the Fortune Global 500 companies are. And turns out that that correlates very well with our Global Connectedness Index. So company level measure shouldn't really be any particular reason why you might expect it to be correlated, but countries that tend to be open also seem to have companies that are, if I may say so, a little bit more cosmopolitan than countries that seem not to be that open. Or to take another example, I've gotten interested in thinking a little bit about cities, and without having my own city index to play around with, it's interesting that, you know, when you take something like PwC's index of cities of opportunity, again, a sort of fairly striking correlation with our Global Connectedness Index. So these are just correlations. We're in the early stages of trying to figure out what to make of them, but there are two research projects that are actually farther advanced based on these data, because compiling all these data was really an excuse to try and do some deeper analysis. And so we've done some analysis of to what extent, what the determinants of interactions between pairs of countries are, and have realized that some of the factors that analyses of merchandise trade have stressed also seem to apply across the board with similar effects across all the different interactions that we look at. And we're doing some network analysis. So that's some of the research payoff, because ultimately, you know, while it's good to be data compiler about the world, maybe hopefully for the world, as a researcher, I'm interested in trying to get a little bit beyond just the compilation of the data to doing something with it. Having talked a little bit about that, let me just sort of turn back to the policy implications of all this. So this is an analysis of US trade, and I should begin by explaining, since we are in the US, there's likely to be particular interest in the US. The US turns out to be semi-strong in terms of our measurements. It does very well on breadth, not so well on depth, and where it has particular problems on depth is in terms of trade. And this is just a little reminder that when we run our little regression analysis about where, given its size, level of development, the advantages conferred by English, which is also a language spoken in many other countries, and a lot of the other standard variables, the USA really does seem to punch below its weight in terms of its involvement in international trade, and particularly in terms of its level of merchandise exports. So that's, I think, a conclusion that of course, one could reach in other manners, but just as a way of illustrating that this kind of analysis, illustrated here just for the US, does have some clear policy implications. What I'd like to do now is ask Arun Kumar to step up. He's seen these slides before. I was speaking at the Commerce Department in early September, where I presented some of these data, and it'd be very interesting to hear what the Commerce Department makes of these patterns. So, Arun?
Well, good evening. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Peter. And Pankaj, thank you for inviting me to this very special event. So it gives me great pleasure to be here this evening to mark the beginning of a new center for the globalization of education and management at Stern, and to honor its first leader, my friend Professor Pankaj Ghemawat, whose work I greatly admire. My delight is doubled by the fact that it is also a chance to be with another person who I greatly admire and privileged to call a friend, Dean Peter Henry. In fact, Peter talked about how he was a neighbor. I have to tell you that when Peter was named Dean of the Stern School, my youngest son was really excited. He said, you know, I can now say I used to shoot hoops with the Dean of the Stern School. So it's great to be here. When I came to graduate school at the MIT Sloan School over 30 years ago, I recall suggesting to one of the deans that the school consider more international material, especially from Asia. His response was to remind me that I had come to a US business school. Well, today the world is very different. Stern clearly recognizes that by creating a center that will explicitly study the globalization of management, and gets a world-leading scholar, Professor Ghemawat, who lives on 2 continents and is actively engaged in at least 3, to be its director. And Dean Henry is himself another example of a scholar with academic and organizational interests that are global. In fact, I recall conversations with him about Arthur Lewis and V.S. Naipaul in the backyard. Pankaj discussed the DHL Global Connectedness Index in a fascinating way. The index provides a framework to think about the globalization of trade and investment, among other dimensions, at the level of economies and countries. It also is a challenge. His last slide is a challenge to the United States, and I would look forward to talking more about that. So today I thought, I also want to mention that in the Commerce Department, our Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker, has used a similar term called global fluency to capture a similar concept at the firm level. So global fluency suggests that a firm think and act globally in terms of exports and other opportunities and build the capabilities to do so. And I think the more globally fluent our firms are, the more we can raise ourselves towards that line. Today what I'm going to do is to talk about the Global Connectedness Framework to give you a picture of the US government's efforts to expand trade and investment and increase the United States' global connectedness. So we have had for many years a focus on export promotion, which helps to increase the depth of global trade connectedness. In fact, the more globally fluent our companies are, especially our small and medium enterprises, the more we can increase the depth of our connectedness. Today, only a tiny minority of our businesses are engaged in exports. And when they are, they generally export to no more than one country. So we see huge upside, as the slide shows. Leading this export promotion effort is my team of commercial officers in embassies and consulates in over 70 countries around the world, and our trade specialists located at US export assistance centers in over 100 cities and at our headquarters in Washington. Along with my colleagues, throughout the International Trade Administration, which is the wing of commerce that deals with trade, we promote exports by providing industry and sector expertise to US businesses. We provide US businesses with export assistance and resources, including market intelligence, business-to-business matchmaking, trade counseling, and commercial diplomacy. And our export promotion activities leverage complementary activities carried out by an extensive ecosystem of district export councils, economic development offices, state and local chambers of commerce, and trade associations. So we have a very large army of people, both our own and our partners, working to help increase US exports. Another significant initiative that promotes connectedness in the area of capital is our Select USA program, established by the Obama administration to promote FDI into the United States. So through interactions and events such as roadshows and annual Select USA Investment Summit, we are constantly in conversation with potential investors around the world. The Global Connectedness Index suggests that advanced economies have not kept up with the shift of economic activity to emerging countries, resulting in a declining breadth of global connectedness. The US actually is doing quite well in this area. We're number 2 on the breadth of global connectedness. But we recognize that 95% of the world's consumers live outside our country. So we are executing focused initiatives to address these opportunities that will help us further increase the breadth and the directionality of our connectedness. In fact, these initiatives will also help us increase the depth of our connectedness. At the Department of Commerce, we are strategically engaged in emerging markets in Latin America, Asia, and Africa to create opportunities for US businesses. Let me quickly go over some of these. Growth in Latin America has created new markets for US exports and presents an opportunity for encouraging more US companies to export to more markets in areas that are really close to us. As a result, the Commerce Department, under the leadership of our Secretary, launched the Look South initiative in January 2014. Look South is a coordinated federal government effort to raise U.S. business awareness of opportunities in Latin America. The U.S. has free trade agreements with 11 countries in Latin America: Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and 6 Latin American CAFTA-DR countries, all of which, in all cases, we have huge opportunities to increase our trade. In 2013, U.S. goods and exports look-south markets increased $12.2 billion for a total of $312 billion. So far in 2014, U.S. exports look-south markets have increased by 5.9% over the same period a year ago, which is double the growth rate of U.S. exports to the rest of the world. So something seems to be working with our look-south initiative. Now let's look at Asia. In regard to Asia, you can see that the Southeast Asian economies stand out for their high depth scores. The Asia region as a whole is home to nearly 60% of global GDP, the fastest growing economies in the world, half the world's population, and an emerging middle class that is eager for American products and services. Secretary Pritzker and the Department of Commerce have laid out the commercial dimension of the Obama administration's rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region. Our Secretary has emphasized the United States' long-term commitment to strengthening well-established trading partnerships, including supporting emerging Asian economies as they address their infrastructure needs and in parallel prepare to become bigger participants in the global trading system. I'm personally very involved in a number of these infrastructure initiatives in Asian countries. In addition, we're helping to strengthen regional mechanisms like the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and the Association for Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC. The APEC actually is meeting in a few days in Beijing. And then let's move to Africa, which is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. Growth in Africa consistently exceeds the world GDP growth rate, with sub-Saharan Africa region growing at 4.9% in real terms. Forecasts predict even higher than average growth in the sub-Saharan region in the foreseeable future. The IMF estimates GDP growth of around 5% for 2014. U.S. exports of goods and services to the continent of Africa reached $50 billion in 2013. I would argue we can do a lot more. They've grown 39% since 2009, or a 9% annual rate on average. We had a successful U.S.-Africa Business Forum in August this year as part of the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. This forum included the announcement of over $14 billion in business deals between American businesses, and African governments for projects being implemented throughout the African continent. And the deals span many sectors: agriculture, infrastructure, information communication technology, and power. So this was almost an electrifying event where we had the leaders of 50 countries in Africa come to Washington, D.C., along with business leaders. The summit also highlighted our major initiative on the continent, Power Africa, an innovative initiative with substantial private sector engagement aimed at doubling electricity access in sub-Saharan Africa, where more than 600 million people currently lack access to electricity. We also have Trade Africa, which is the partnership between the United States and participating sub-Saharan African nations that seeks to increase international and regional trade in the region. These initiatives seek to deepen our commercial engagement in the region and to promote sustainable and strong growth throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Just this year, my organization has opened 4 new offices in Africa in countries that we were not previously physically present in. We will also help organize 10 new trade missions and 10 reverse trade missions by 2020, working with other US government agencies. NEI Next will help more American companies reach overseas markets by improving data, providing information on specific opportunities, working more closely with financing organizations, and partnering with states and communities to empower local export efforts. Under the NEI, we have made progress in many areas, from total exports to export-supported jobs to more businesses exporting than ever before. Since 2009, US companies have had 4 years of record exports, reaching an all-time high of $2.3 trillion in 2013. Exports now support 11.3 million jobs in communities across the country, up 1.6 million since 2009. And exports have driven nearly a third of economic growth since mid-2009 and account for nearly 14% of our economy. So we seem to be on an upswing, and NEI Next is meant to keep it powered further. So in conclusion, I want to say we are aligned with the thinking behind the Global Connectedness Index. Congratulations to you, Pankaj, and to Stephen Altman on a wonderful job in producing this index. And we are working to enhance both the depth, all three, the depth, breadth, and directionality of our connectedness. It's been great for me, a privilege to be here this evening, an honor truly, and I'd like to congratulate you on the new center. Thank you.
So I think you've had a preview of coming attractions, so let me just flash up slide and then invite Chris Kane to come and discuss a little bit what the initiative that these people are involved in. So can I invite Chris Kane, who, to remind you, is the president of the Center for Global Enterprise, to come and discuss one of the initiatives that the center is involved with, not so much on basic globalization, but on the management front. Chris.
Great. Thank you, Pankaj. Good evening, everybody. I'm excited to be here, and we're very excited to have this collaboration with Pankaj's new Center for Globalization of Education and Management. And as Pankaj said, the Center for Global Enterprise is a New York City-based research organization. We've been in existence for about a year and a half. And our objective really is to look at the changing structure and nature of the corporation in the 21st century and the management best practices that are going to be created as a result of the changing nature of the company. Right? So we have a commitment to open research, open learning from a global perspective and a global default. And so the focus of Pankaj's new center on education and management fits beautifully with what the originating purpose of the Center for Global Enterprise is all about. Over the last year and a half, we have been conducting what we call CEO exchanges, which are peer-to-peer learning sessions between CEOs from around the world to really put on the table what are the issues, what are the management issues that CEOs of privately owned enterprises, publicly traded enterprises, state-owned enterprises are grappling with in this era of globalization and global economic integration. And so one of the things that have come from those CEO exchanges, which we've held in Beijing, we've held in Stanford, and we've held in Europe, and the next one we're holding in India in March, has been that CEOs from large enterprises have said, you know, what we're really grappling with in this era of economic integration are business models for speed. I have a footprint around the world, but I can't move fast enough. The world is integrated, it's being driven by technological developments and innovation, and I have to, the burden is on me to keep up the speed at which the world is working with my organization, which happens to be large. Now, in turn, the small company CEOs are saying, you know, I have business models for speed. I just don't have business models for scale. So how do I maximize the opportunity of globalization as a small enterprise? And we heard Arun talk about the potential and the opportunity for small and medium businesses from the United States. But the question is, what are the management practices? What are the management processes? How do companies grapple with this opportunity that exists out there? So the Center for Global Enterprise and Pankaj's Center and New York Stern have launched this in collaboration, a project on business models for speed and scale, designed exactly to address this challenge, this tension that CEOs from large and small companies, state-owned enterprises, privately owned enterprises, publicly traded enterprises are grappling with. We're going to be looking over the next year or so at 6 different management principles, all of which all CEOs deal with. How do you balance global versus local sales and marketing? How do you deal with supply chain, market access, and distribution efficiency? How do you deal with company culture, leadership identification and development? How do you address intellectual property, creating intellectual property, protecting intellectual property, and leveraging intellectual property for growth? How do you address economic and financial management, things like in an integrated economy, but maybe not in an integrated corporate structure? How do you deal with cash management, treasury functions, et cetera, so that your financial model is as contemporary as your business model? And lastly, how do you deal with building government trust for market access and freedom of action? So these 6 management disciplines are what the project is looking at and what these tremendous workstream leaders that Pankaj has been able to recruit to this are going to be working on And we'll take their individual work stream efforts and integrate them. Pankaj will integrate them into a conversation and a framework about, so what are the contemporary management best practices for finding the intersection of business models for speed and scale. So we're very excited about this collaboration. We've got a lot of work to do, but we have a great confidence that it will produce something of applied research and applied management value for the stakeholders who happen to find this topic as interesting and, as we do. So thank you, Pankaj.
And let me just put up one more slide, and then we can open this up to any questions that people might have. But I did want to say something about the educational mission of the center, because so far we focused on globalization. Chris has talked a little bit about management, and I just wanted to make sure that the third part, the third substantive in the center's name, did get a little bit of attention. So this, this in some sense is a one-slide summary of why I found Stern and more broadly NYU the single most exciting academic institution to try and come back to when I decided to reestablish a presence in the US. The circles surrounded by, I guess, maybe we can call them halos. Those are portal campuses, of which there are 3, New York, Abu Dhabi, and Shanghai. And then there are a whole bunch of other global network university sites. So on the educational front, one of the things that the center, and personally I'm going to be very involved in, is this notion that the university has developed over the last little bit that it really would be interesting to leverage these different sites, which are literally unparalleled in terms of no other university having a footprint like this, to develop a few courses that actually are offered across the 3 campuses, but in globally inflected versions. So what we're trying to develop, and I'm very pleased to see, for instance, Matthew Santirocco in the back. Matthew, can you raise your hand? You said you'd applaud, but I'll just get you to wave for now. Who's the Senior Vice Provost in charge of undergraduate academic affairs at NYU. And in collaboration, I've had lots of discussions with Matthew about how this is going to happen. And one of the things that we've sort of decided is that we really are going to try and push the technological frontier in terms of figuring out how, after developing a course that's offered at Stern here in the spring, how we think about moving relatively quickly to offering some kind of regionally inflected version of that at the other sites within the global university. So that's one of the, to me, very exciting educational pieces of what I see as some of the challenges and some of the opportunities at NYU. And with that, having covered, well, there are only 3 bases, so having covered all 3 bases, globalization, education, and management, seems time for me to stop talking and showing slides and simply see if there are any questions or comments that people might have before we can adjourn to the reception that I think is planned as the next item on the agenda. So. Sort of a little bit like MBA classroom, but I can't resort to the same tactics here, which involve cold calling. Yes, I have Arun Kumar raising her hand.
Okay, so I've actually a real question. So how are you going to make it accessible for different people on different portals? How are you going to structure the process to make it more accessible to the international market?
Sort of a pointed question, and I think that one of the things, I actually experimented with offering a MOOC last year in the January-February timeframe, and for those of you who aren't familiar with this, this is just a massive open online course. It became clear that technology by itself doesn't solve the problems. Putting the stuff up on a website is no particular way of actually reaching a worldwide audience. So I think what we're thinking of is a hybrid model where some of the content would be developed in digital format, but there would always be some degree of local involvement in making sure that this doesn't end up becoming an utterly disconnected, detached experience. Because my reading from my MOOC experience is, while that model is good for certain things, it certainly has some limitations as well, and probably does not build the kind of engagement that's being targeted by this effort. So it is going to be a hybrid rather than something done with technology alone. And so there are a couple of such experiments underway, but I think one commonality, I'm not sure that I'm aware of the details of all of them, is that there's almost always going to be some component of on-site human intervention as opposed to just an online delivery vehicle with the content sitting on some website somewhere. Thank you for the question.
Began to answer that, one of these. What do you have, Pankaj, some thought of a philosophical or a pedagogical framework to this center?
I think I would characterize that as a work in progress. I think I have some specific thoughts about the three individual components that I've talked about, but I have trouble articulating an overarching design principle beyond. All of these things are sort of, take the notion that, countries are still not totally integrated with each other and quite different, in fact, from each other very, very seriously. So that's why we measure globalization. That's why global management is more than just a matter of having developed a business model in one country, cloning it around the world. And that's why the educational piece is going to involve something that is regionally inflected rather than the notion that we can come up with a design that works equally well everywhere. So I think in terms of, it's not exactly a response to your question, but I think in terms of what a philosophical underpinning is that's common across these three efforts, it's this notion that in a world that isn't very integrated, a lot of mischief has been created by pretending that it's otherwise or can quickly be changed. And while I'm certainly a believer in globalization, I do think it has to recognize that people are different in different parts of the world, and that affects everything from management to education to pretty much any other area of activity you can think of.
Is this going to be a major, or is it really a think tank center? Will you have classes that would become part of, like a major, like finance or accounting?
I think since it's early days, a lot remains to be seen, but certainly this globalization of business course that I'm developing will count towards the global business concentration. I think there's another concentration as well within Stern that will count towards. And then I think we literally, with this and with the 5 or 6 other attempts to develop quote-unquote signature courses that are offered at different campuses, we're still trying to figure out how this will actually work, how it will fit into existing academic structures. And it's driven not so much by a clear sense of what the answers to those questions are, but rather a clear sense that with these 3 global portals, there is a unique opportunity at NYU to do something that no other university is currently doing. Because I think, and again, I probably shouldn't get too deep into comparisons, but I think I was involved for 3 years working on an AACSB task force on the globalization of management education. And a lot of what happens is exchange programs where there's very little coordination in effect by the institution that's handing off the students with the institution that's actually receiving them. So people do get a little bit of international experience. They get to travel a bit. They're probably somewhat better global citizens as a result. But I do remember, because for a professor, lecturing a room full of deans, so I had 400 deans at the AACSB Deans Conference, and my basic point to them was, look, if all we do is get interesting people together and take them to interesting places, we're a specialized branch of the travel and hospitality sector. And so there's got to be something more in terms of some idea of what it is that we're trying to do in the classroom as a complement to all the indubitably valuable experiential learning that's stressed in this area.
Pankaj, I wonder if you'd say more about your growing interest in cities and the interconnectedness index. I'm thinking of Jane Jacobs, who really said that cities are the economies of the world, and that, and I'm thinking in the U.S. Just one hypothesis that so many of the U.S. exports do not come from cities. They're resources and agriculture, and even places like Caterpillar, which are out in the middle of the pasture. So I'm just wondering if part of the future of U.S. interconnectedness and maybe more breadth coming from the U.S. might be tied up with cities.
Well, so I actually have to head to Minneapolis on Thursday, and I'm supposed to do some talks to local city leaders about Minneapolis because they're quite concerned about exactly the phenomenon that you're describing. If you look at that metro area, the leading exports of Minneapolis-St. Paul are crops, and one suspects these are not grown within the metropolitan limits of Minneapolis-St. Paul. And so given the number of high-tech companies that they have, medical instruments, electronics, a range of other things, there's a sense that somehow Minneapolis just hasn't focused enough on actually trying to figure out how it as a city can be more than a transshipment point for agricultural exports as the largest category of exports to the rest of the world. And my interest in this got stirred a little bit by challenge of being invited to speak to Stern students in the launch week of the MBA program. This is the first week they're here, and I was trying to think, as you probably already deduced, I'm not very good at doing inspirational talks, so I was trying to think of something harder-edged I could actually do with these students. And so it struck me that it might be interesting to compare cities in terms of their connectedness with the rest of the world. So I had a little slide where I asked students, first of all, which do you think is the more global city, New York or Tokyo? And with the exception, however you define global, there was no pre-commitment to a particular notion of global there, with the exception of 5 to 10 people in the group of entering Stern MBAs. Everybody voted for New York. I then ran through some of the numbers I'd uncovered over the summer, and it turns out that when you look at growth rates, Tokyo's been growing faster in population terms than New York. When you look at Fortune 500 companies, Tokyo has more Fortune 500 companies than New York. High-tech patents, Tokyo has roughly 6 times the number of high-tech patents filed every year that New York does. In terms of this theory of creative class being what drives great cities, Tokyo's, unless you count finance and accounting as creative class employment, Tokyo actually has a higher percentage employment in the creative class than New York does. Tokyo has more restaurants per capita, and actually if you look at the number of Michelin stars, Tokyo does better than New York, London, and Paris combined in terms of total. And so, you know, moment for reflection with the MBAs, are we all at the wrong business school in the wrong city? And then the point I was trying to lead them towards is there is one other dimension of difference between Tokyo and New York that seems salient. New York just has more connectedness with the rest of the world along dimensions ranging from the percentage of population that are immigrants to what my friend suggested, the number of Bloomberg terminals as a measure of integration with the world financial system, to a whole host of other areas. And so I'm not an expert on cities. I've just started to study this literature, but what seems to be missing from, and I was asking my colleague Paul Romer about this the other day because he leads the urbanization initiative here. What seems to be missing a little bit from the cities literature is the notion that what makes a city great is not just what's in the city, but the kinds of connections it has with the rest of the world. And so on that limited aspect of cities, I think that given some of this prior work may actually be helpful at making a little bit of headway. And let's see what we're doing.
Countries within are not all integrated. Many countries are not very well integrated within. I was wondering if that has an effect on the breadth measurement, especially in the case of US, which is highly integrated within. And could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. Once you take the notion of a world in which countries aren't very integrated with each other seriously, the internal market starts to loom larger. And particularly when you think about the BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, these are all very large countries with relatively poor to very poor internal infrastructure. So you hear the same thing in Brazil that you do in India, and even to some extent in China, which is thinking of these countries as entirely integrated is probably not internally, is missing out on another very important source of potential gains. And so that's a little bit a theme that I'm trying to work into some of my academic research as well as my policy-oriented work, because I used to do quote-unquote mainstream strategy, which didn't have an international component. And I have a lot of my friends ask me, you were doing okay in mainstream strategy. Why did you do something as sort of secondary as international strategy? And I think the one thing I've been able to tell them is that when we look at contexts in which differences are so clear, barriers to integration are so clear, and there's so much gains from further integration, that actually draws us back in a domestic context to thinking about things that we may have tended to overlook. So I would argue that a lot of the mainstream or single country strategy literature has actually tended to ignore the differences between regions, the extent to which connectivity is actually imperfect. And one way of bringing something back from international strategy into single country strategy is, at least for certain kinds of medium-sized to large countries, recognizing that internal differences are another very powerful, represent another very important feature and clearly embody some potential for additional integration. So I think we have 3 more minutes, so short question and a short answer, or a long question and no answer whatsoever. Peter?
Thank you very much. You've pulled together a tremendous amount of data, and I know in doing research, you often find things that you aren't able to answer in the data. I'm wondering if you ran across that, if you could share what haven't you been able to show us because either the data isn't there or it's to come. Kind of, what are the barriers or what are the things that you haven't been able to discern that you would like to about globalization?
So in the index, I'd say that the weakest part of it are the informational measures. We have 3. We look at printed publication exports, but that misses out on licensing deals, et cetera, which is how most US magazines, for instance, get published in other parts of the world. We have some limited data on international phone calls, and then on internet connectivity, we don't actually have good data on internet traffic flows between pairs of countries. So there, unfortunately, instead of relying on a flow measure, we look at a capacity measure. So every time, and I've been busy collecting some data on ties on Twitter, anytime I can find some way of boosting or improving the informational content of the index, that strikes me as a particularly high priority. So with that, I think I've certainly said more than enough. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for coming.